Welcome to our online video series, Reading Hope in Trying Times. Our guest today is our good friend Lori Erickson. Lori is an Episcopal deacon and is one of America's top travel writers specializing in spiritual travels. She's the author of Holy Rover, Journeys in Search of Mystery, Miracles, and God, and also Near the Exit, Travels with the Not-So-Grim Reaper. She's written more than 1,000 articles for publications that include National Geographic Traveler, Better Homes and Gardens, The Christian Century, Sojourners, and the Los Angeles Times. Her website, Spiritual Travels, features holy sites around the world. She also serves as a curator for the Faith and Travel section on the Compassionate Christianity website. So welcome, Lori.
Well, thank you, Brian. I'm delighted to get the chance to talk with you.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about how God's helped you through trying times in your life, and then also how Near the Exit, your book, Near the Exit in particular, is relevant in today's circumstances.
Mm-hmm. So, well, that's a big question, how God has helped me through trying times. I would say, looking back on my life, that it's pretty clear that as I put it, the Holy Spirit often rides in on the same horse as tragedy or difficulty. That often it's during hard times that I think the hand of God, feeling of grace is most felt. And in my work, I read a lot about the spiritual power of travel to transform us. And so I write a lot about pilgrimage, about the ways in which the journey, the inner journey and the outer journey mirror each other, stimulate each other. And so I think one of the points that I like to reiterate to people is that travel and travail have the same root, and that often it's on a journey of one sort or another, again, inner or outer, that our mettle is tested and that we get the chance to see the hand of God move in ways that we probably wouldn't notice if we were just in the midst of our ordinary routines. My latest book, Near the Exit, Travels with the Not-So-Grim Reaper, is an example of that. The genesis for the book came during the week when my mother entered memory care in a nursing home the same week that my 59-year-old brother died unexpectedly of a heart attack. And in my grief and sorrow, I looked to travel for inspiration and meaning, because throughout my life, travel has been a source of inspiration and meaning. And so I started looking for places that had taught me about mortality. And so that's the focus of the book. Some of the places are far away and some of the places are close to home, like the nursing home where my mother lived for several years. And I would say, too, that I was thinking about what I would say this morning, because in some ways, being a travel writer is one of the most useless occupations during a time of global pandemic, because people are rightly sticking close to home. But I'm a spiritual travel writer. And the way I define that is, again, about the inner journey. And sometimes that goes hand in hand with an outer journey. But other times, I think the inner journey comes when we are stuck at home, stuck in a position where we don't want to be. And so I do think my work actually does have some things to say during this time about the inner journey is always the most significant of journeys. And I think that, let me just shift gears for a minute. There's a chapter in my book about Crestone, Colorado, which I think has some lessons maybe in this current time that I'd like to talk about. So Crestone is a small little town, only 150 people. It's in south central Colorado, not too far from the Great Sand Dunes National Monument. And it's unique in that it has more than 24 spiritual centers, holy sites there. The reason is that during the 1970s, there was a wealthy philanthropist couple that came in, bought a bunch of land, and then offered it free of charge to any religious group that was willing to put a center there. And another interesting thing about Crestone, which is why I was most interested in writing about it, is that it has the only non-denominational open-air cremation ground in the United States. And so I'm sure many people have seen pictures or perhaps even visited India to see the burning of bodies on the banks of the Ganges. And Crestone does a variation of that. I mean, it has its own unique stamp on it, but they have an open air holy site shrine outside of town with a platform there, beautifully designed. And several times during the year, residents of the town see their neighbors' bodies go up in smoke. And it was fascinating to get the chance to be there and to talk to people about what that meant, to have that reminder of mortality be so visceral for them. And I have been thinking about that a lot in relation to the current crisis going on. That I think, one of the universal points of all religions is that death is inevitable. But I think that the experience of Crestone is an example of how life lived in the midst of that knowledge does not have to be grim or depressing. And people talk to me about the spiritual power of seeing that happen. One Zen monk in particular said it was the most powerful Buddhist teaching that anyone can have, is to see that ultimate lesson in impermanence. And I think what's going on now is a bit of a version of that, of people are reminded of their mortality, of the mortality of their loved ones. And there inevitably is a lot of fear with that, and we shouldn't downplay that. But I also think it's worth reminding us that we always live with mortality, and it's just more obvious right now. And as it is in Crestone when you visit that cremation ground. And so there are no easy answers for this, but I think part of what I learned from writing my book is this sense that these are hard lessons, but they are also lessons that can greatly deepen us and make us treasure what we have, and make us, one reaction is to hunker down and be fearful and try to control everything. And the other reaction, I think, is to open up our hands and say, what happens, happens. I can do my best to protect myself and my loved ones, but ultimately it is not in our control. And that's the spiritual lesson, I think, of a time like now.
So you have a treasure trove of articles on your website about all these different wonderful places that you traveled, and you have a lot of great photography associated with those too. So since everyone is now at home for quite some time, and in addition to reading books, they might be interested in a virtual trip. So yes. Do you have a few of your website articles, trip-related website articles that you would point people to?
Uh-huh. Well, the first one that comes to mind is Lourdes in France, the great healing shrine that is certainly associated with illness, but in a positive way. One of the things that I write about on my website, Spiritual Travels, about Lourdes is I was so struck by the fact that it was obviously full of people who were dealing with physical illness of one sort or another, but it was also a place of joy and of hope. And so I think an article like that might be of interest. Chimayo in New Mexico, which is sometimes called the Lourdes of North America, which is a Spanish colonial adobe church built in the early 1800s that is known for its holy dirt. Pilgrims come by the thousands there, especially during Holy Week. I do think that there is a lot to be said for armchair travel and including armchair spiritual travel, because the world is full of beautiful, amazing, meaningful, holy sites. And often there are really beautiful pictures associated with that. My husband has taken many of the pictures that are on my website. I've taken some, but my husband is more of a photographer than I am, certainly. And it is certainly possible to travel through a video screen, through a laptop. And I hope people will browse around. My sites are primarily, I would say maybe 70% of them are Christian, and then the other 30% are in other traditions, a lot of Buddhist sites, a lot of Native American sites, some beautiful sights in nature. And, people can dream about what they're going to do once the current restrictions are lifted.
Lori, one of the places that you traveled was Assisi in Italy. So would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Mhm. Yes, that's the last chapter in my book, Near the Exit. Assisi, of course, is associated with St. Francis. And when I was there, I learned a lot about St. Francis. I thought I knew quite a bit about his life before I went there, but being in the place where he had lived and worked and done his ministry was enormously meaningful. And one of the things that I learned there was his coinage of the phrase "sister death," which I had never heard before. Like many Christians, I've sung the famous hymn that's based on his words, "Brother Sun, Sister Moon," a great canticle of the creatures. And that hymn mentions death, but it doesn't use his original use of the phrase "sister death," which I thought was fascinating. To learn that in his last days, he told his followers to come close, and he had them dictate that stanza of his famous song, talking about sister death, welcoming sister death. And the more I thought about it, that naming of death as kin, as part of the family, as sister, I thought was a profound meditation that was entirely in keeping with the rest of Francis' life, where all parts of creation, the sun, the wind, the rain, everything was part of his family, we viewed as his relatives. And so it's not surprising that he would view death as sister. But that idea of sister was interesting to me too, that, there's not one way of relating to a sister. Sometimes they live far away, sometimes they live close by. You might be alienated from a sister, you might be very close to a sister. But there's still a bond of connection. And even if they live across the globe, there is a tie that binds you. And I think that that's true for death as well. And I think also, maybe at some level, Francis, there was a correspondence with this idea that a woman gave him life, his mother gave him life, and a woman would take it away, sister death. And I think there's a kind of beauty and symmetry to that as well. And in the church, the big basilica at Assisi, there's a beautiful fresco that I write about. It's on the lower floor. I'm sure some of the people who view this video have been to Assisi and maybe know that church. And there's an image of Francis dressed in his patched brown robe, and he's standing next to a skeleton, and the skeleton is wearing rags. But the skeleton is also wearing a gold crown that's sort of askew on its head. And Francis has his arm on the shoulder of the skeleton, and there's a kind of comfort with the skeleton, with death, with mortality there. And in his other hand, he holds up, and you can see the mark of stigmata on his palm. And so it's this beautiful symbolic linking of death and of resurrection and of the life that comes from suffering. And the more I thought about it, that was the most meaningful part of my visit to Assisi, was that fresco, hearing the story of Sister Death, and realizing this wise, humble man still has so much to teach us. Whether or not we're able to go to Assisi in person, I think people can learn from his story. So,
Lori, with the coronavirus spreading, we know that nursing homes are an even more critical and focal point for protecting people. And that's one of the topics, the nursing homes in general is one of the topics that you deal with in your book. So can you talk a little bit about where you see that today?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So in my book, I wanted to make certain that I had a mixture of places far away and places close to home. And I really wanted to write about the nursing home where my mother lived, and specifically the memory care unit where my mother lived for about 2.5 years. And the more time I spent there, the more I realized that it also was a journey to get there. And it was a kind of foreign country. And I think any memory care unit in particular is a foreign country. There's a border control, for example. You have to press buttons in order to get in and out. The people who are there are like people who have expired passports and they know that they can't leave. It has its own climate, its own cuisine, its own customs, and its own sort of timelessness. And and I realize we're doing it, we're now living through a time when people aren't able to visit their loved ones in nursing homes. And I think that's a tremendous loss. I mean, in order to protect our elders, we have to stay away from them. And that's a hard thing to do. But I think maybe, thinking of the nursing home as a foreign country that you can't get to right now, it might be helpful that it's a place where that has its own life and its own routines and its own residents and citizens. And they also are having to, in a sense, negotiate the customs of that world in a more focused way right now. And so, and especially the ones who don't have cognitive decline like my mother did. I would hope that people within nursing homes would take this as a spiritual opportunity uh, to, because in the end, we're all left alone. We all have to find our own inner resources. And I think one of the people that I quote in that chapter is Kathleen Dowling Singh, Singh, who wrote a really wonderful book about grace and dying. And she writes about the fact that as people approach death, that everything else falls away, but that there is a natural process of transformation, spiritual transformation that occurs then. And so, regardless of how long the quarantine lasts, how long we have to live in fear of this disease, those lessons, whether you're in a nursing home or in full health in the prime of your life, those are good lessons to, in a sense, rehearse your final chapter, because there's no more powerful spiritual meditation than that. I think I agree with the Buddhists on that. Meditating on your own end is it's jet fuel for spiritual growth. And so I hope people can take advantage of that.
So Lori, I really want to thank you for joining us. This has been really a valuable perspective on how we can all take virtual spiritual travels, even if we're, kind of locked in our homes. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Brian.